through this in real time. But here's the thing. While this period is certainly unprecedented, it is not a complete anomaly, simply some random coincidence to be dismissed. Now, what's happening right now is the direct result of decades of unaddressed prejudice and inequality. The truth is, when it comes to all those tidy stories of hard work and self-determination that we like to tell ourselves about America, well, the reality is a lot more complicated than that. Because for too many people in this country, no matter how hard they work, there are structural barriers working against them that just make the road longer and rockier. And sometimes it's almost impossible to move upward at all. Because if you're required to work during a pandemic, but don't have enough protective equipment or health insurance from your employer or paid sick leave, well, what is more essential, your work or your life? If you don't feel safe driving your own car in your own neighborhood, or going for a jog or buying some candy at 7-Eleven or bird watching, if you can't even approach the police without fearing for your life, well, then how do you begin to chart your own course? And as so often is the case, these questions compound upon themselves. So if you're struggling already just to keep your head above water, if you're living in a constant state of fear, how much farther behind will you be after months in quarantine and without a job? These are uncomfortable questions. Questions that have dogged this country for generations, but are now staring us in the face every time we look at our phones or hear helicopters circling our neighborhoods. And the tough part is, nobody has all the answers. If my generation did, trust me, we'd have fixed all of this a long time ago. But that doesn't mean we should feel hopeless. Just the opposite. Because what we finally do have is focus. We see what's happening in stark relief. We see how these inequalities are playing out on our streets. And it's not just the communities most affected by these challenges that see it now. It's folks all across the country who for too long have had the luxury and privilege of looking away. We all have no choice but to see what has been staring us in the face for years, for centuries. So the question is, how will we respond? I'm here today to talk to you, not as the former First Lady, but
I have a very fine sneaker collection, but I thought if I wore sneakers, it looked like I was trying too hard.
Fair.
You know what I mean?
Fair.
You don't.
Fair. You don't want to look like you're pandering or anything.
You don't want to look like the old guy in the club. You know what I mean?
Yeah, the guy who's been there too long, and I know exactly what you mean, President. I know exactly what you mean. For Complex News, it's 360 with Speedy Mormon. I'm him, and today we have a very special guest, maybe the most special guest that we could possibly have. It's the 44th President of the United States, Mr. Barack Obama. How are you, man?
I am doing great. Thank you so much for having me.
We are so very honored, and I think back to years ago, maybe the first time you were ever on 60 Minutes.
Right.
Malia was asked, what does your dad make other than tuna fish? And she said, only chili, and that's it. And here we are in Ben's Chili Bowl in Washington, D.C. It makes sense. I'm wondering, have you learned to make anything else, or is that it for you?
You know what? I've got a few other things under my sleeve, but basically my repertoire is pretty small. And I think it's fair to say that since that time, I have done even less cooking. during the presidency, one thing you had was some chefs who could really throw down and fix some good food. So fortunately, Ben's Chili Bowl has been an iconic spot here in D.C. And I've had some past smokes here, and it is worth visiting for those who don't know about it.
Now, the memoir, obviously, A Promised Land, came out this week, and I think that it did a really good job, and you did a really good job of kind of humanizing yourself in a way that maybe a lot of people haven't seen before, including myself. I was kind of shocked that you, the President of the United States, is a human being too. You know what I'm saying? You are very open in the book about your racial identity, starting very early on. I'm biracial as well, same dynamic, white mom, black dad. And you say that you too have experienced your fair share of racial slights from a young age. I'm wondering, maybe is there one that stuck out that kind of you remember?
You know, I mentioned in the book, and I've spoken about this before. I grew up in Hawaii, and in some ways, it's hard to have a childhood that is less stressful. You know, it's 80 degrees, you got beaches. There's a lot of different kinds of people of different backgrounds, hues, and so in some ways I was protected and insulated from it. But even in Hawaii, you'd start, as you became a teenager, walking by a car and suddenly you'd hear the locks go down, or you get in an elevator and the purse would be clutched. Before I started playing basketball, I played tennis for a while, and I remember looking at the brackets that had been set up for a tournament and putting my finger on it, and the tennis coach at the time says, be careful, you might rub off on the paper, right? And this is somebody who's instructing young people at the school that I was at. So those kinds of things I think we all have had to deal with, but I'm careful to make the point that relative to kids who are growing up in Philly or Chicago or the Bronx, the kinds of pressures they have to experience at an earlier age are entirely different. And part of my inspiration to get into politics was the inspiration of the civil rights movement, and knowing that I want to live in a country where kids aren't feeling that feeling.
And don't have to experience.
That. All of us as humans are going to have to go through hardships. Some of us are going to be luckier than others. But there shouldn't be a systemic situation where some kids from an early age are suddenly feeling like somehow they might be outside looking in.
As the story goes, you end up in New York studying at Columbia University before you go to Chicago.
Right.
And there's a quick line that for many would just skate by, but you said that you bounced around in a couple of ill-fitting jobs in New York. Yeah. I'm wondering what those jobs were. Is the former president delivering pizzas on the weekend, or what were these jobs?
Listen, I had all kinds of jobs in New York, and I had all kinds of living arrangements in New York, because this is the early 80s, and New York had just come out of bankruptcy, and it was just starting to become what we now know of as New York. So Times Square is still rough, and there are big chunks of the city that are still torn up. But you're starting to see rents going up, and I was broke. I'm a student, and so I'm living in sublets that you find out that the person subletting it to you doesn't actually have a lease. You have to go down to housing court, and you've lost your deposit. There was one place where I was staying where the guy was actually doing construction in the room right next to where I was, so rubble's kind of spilling into your living space. And I did construction work. I remember the New York firefighters they had to do something with their medical records, and there was a big refiling job, and I was doing that. And then I worked for a magazine for a while. There was a business magazine, and then I left because I knew that what I wanted to do was really change the world and be part of a broader movement for social change. But even then, I was kind of bouncing around trying different things until this group of churches in Chicago called me up and said, look, we're setting up a community organization. Do you want to drive out here? And I drove out there sight unseen, and that's really where I started growing up, learning how I might be able to have an impact.
Yeah, they scooped you up for a calm 13K,
13K, man.
if I'm not mistaken.
And car expenses.
You can't forget about the car expenses. You say a line in the book, now that we're speaking about jobs, you say, I believe you say, for all its power and pomp, the presidency is still just a job. And that's a lens that maybe a lot of people have never thought about it through. You maybe had the world's shortest commute ever. The West Colony, I think you said it was a 1-minute walk outside. Why do you put it through that lens of it just being a job? And maybe what's that work-life balance like?
Well, part of the goal of the book, because you did a good job mentioning sort of the passage I go through, right? I talk about my youth, the fact that I was not somebody who was born into a family that was political. We certainly weren't wealthy. I wasn't somebody who was saying that I was going to be president and being student council and all that stuff. And the reason is because I want young people who pick up the book to feel as if they're on a journey with somebody who's just like them. I was not so special or so exceptional. I had some good breaks. I had some opportunities. I had some mentors and people who looked after me. But probably the most important thing that I did was just say to myself, you know what, if I'm going to do something with my life, let it be something that has a broader impact on other people. And that landed me in the White House. And so I want people to be able to relate to that because I think so many young people look at the presidency or politics or government as something so far removed, so distant that they can't relate. But the bottom line is this is a group of people who are trying to make decisions about how we together are sharing resources and solving problems. And it's not that different from a lot of other organizations. The stakes are higher, but it is something that is understandable if you choose to pay attention to it. And that is part of the job of citizenship, is us recognizing this is a government of, by, and for the people. It's not them ruling over us. It's how do we come together to rule ourselves.
Yeah, there was a time, especially early on in your political career, where it seemed like absolutely nothing was going your way. You got blown out by Rush. Then your American Express card gets declined. You're trying to rent a car. You go to the DNC. You don't even have the right credential. Can't get on the floor of the convention. You say in the book that you can't get into a party that night. Then you wind up crashing on the couch. It seems like absolutely nothing was going your way.
That was not a good moment.
Not a good moment, but you still became president. Yeah. You didn't let it deter you. It seems as though you bet on yourself almost. And I'm wondering why. Why is it so important to bet on yourself?
Yeah, I tell that story because here I am. I've lost an election for Congress, and I'm going to the Democratic National Convention. Nobody's paying attention to me. I can't even really get on the floor. I'm feeling discouraged. I'm broke. Michelle is mad at me because I've been spending a lot of time on politics, and that has put some strain on our family budget. We've already got at that point one young child and one on the way, and yet 4 years later, I was the keynote speaker at
that same convention. Yeah.
Except this one was in Boston. And 6 years later, I'm running for president. And it gives you some sense of the fact that if there's anything that I've learned, not just in politics but in life, is persistence in pursuit of a goal. If you believe in that goal, if you care about it. Now, a lot of luck is still involved, and I one of the things that I write about in A Promised Land is sometimes I would meet people who've been successful, Wall Street, CEOs and bankers, who somehow think, I'm successful, and it's because I'm smarter than everybody else. And I write about the fact that, anybody who doesn't attribute some of what's happened to them to good fortune, who thinks it's all them,
right.
To me, that means you don't really have much insight into how the world works. Because there are a lot of people who work hard. There are a lot of people who make a bet on themselves, who are talented, but things just don't work out. And that's part of the reason why my politics has always been about making sure everybody has a chance, and when people fall, society's there to give them a little bit of a hand up, because none of us are immune from bad fortune, just like good fortune, and we don't know ahead of time who that's going to be.
Yeah. I don't know if you're able to tell this by looking at me, but I haven't lived through many presidents.
I can. Are you rubbing in the fact that you are young and I'm
No, not quite. But realistically, I haven't lived through many presidents. Right. But many people consider you to be the cool president. A colleague and I were speaking, and he described President George W. Bush as the president that you want to have a beer with. I'm wondering, for someone maybe even younger than myself who didn't get a chance to live through your presidency, in a line or so, how would you frame your presidency? What type of president were you? Who were you?
I would say I'm the president who tried to bring everybody to the table and to include everybody in the benefits and the bounty of America. Look, as my press secretary, Robert Gibbs, said while we were running for president, people noticed that none of my predecessors looked like me.
Yeah.
Right? So there was obvious symbolism to being the first African-American president. But beyond that, I was just as concerned with what's happening to poor rural white folks or Latinos who are in bad schools and not getting the kinds of health care that they need, or LGBTQ kids who were being bullied and left out. I'd like to think that my presidency was about saying everybody matters, not just some of us, and then trying to operationalize that.
If you were born, not when you were, but say the year 2000, a Gen Z young Barack Obama,
right.
What does that look like? Who is that Barack Obama, you think?
Who knows? I will say that when I look at my daughters, this generation, the generation that makes up a lot of your viewership and leadership, is more sophisticated, been exposed to more, better educated as a general rule, I think more open to people's differences. You think about just something like the image of black folks that was available to me when I was growing up, where you had Sidney Poitier and you had Diane Carroll on TV, maybe just a handful of folks. Now, through both television and the internet, you have black lawyers, black doctors, you had a black president and a black first lady, you had folks of every walk of life doing everything, business leaders, entrepreneurs, music is dominated by hip hop. So your generation, I think, and I guess if I was growing up now, I would feel that there are so many more options available to me in terms of how I want to be, who I want to emulate, what fields I want to go into, and that's a powerful thing. But I also would like to think that I would still recognize we've got a lot more work to do. And this summer, after the George Floyd killing, to see this generation take up the baton of John Lewis and Diane Nash and Bob Moses and some of the heroes of the civil rights movement and say, no, we're going to keep pressing for more justice and more equity, more fairness. That was inspiring to me. I'd like to think I would have been one of those young people who said, we got more work to do.
Do you think that you would have resembled your daughters?
They're smarter than I am and cooler. They've always been cooler. I had to develop it. They got that from their mama. When I look at Malia and Sasha and the degree of confidence combined with kindness and their instinct of treating everybody with respect and helping people, I'm really proud of them. And the fact that they were able to do that, going through this very strange experience of growing up in the White House, is a testament to Michelle and my mother-in-law and all the people who helped raise them. But also just an internal grace that they've had that I'm really proud of.
On a more serious note, and on maybe all fronts, it feels like this is the biggest divide that I've lived through, whether it's racial, whether it's financial, in almost every way that I can think of. And there's a quote from your book that sticks out, or you may have said it in an interview actually. You say, I come out of this book very worried about the degree to which we do not have a common baseline of fact. And I want to share with you my experience of watching the presidential debates. This is I've covered elections, the last election, but when I was watching the presidential debates, I tried to come into it with an open mind. And so what I would do is I would flip back and forth between Fox News and CNN.
Right.
And after watching, when presented with the identical content, right? We all watch the same debate. If I put on Fox News, the lower third would say, Biden stumbles through debate. And then I put on CNN and it says, Trump stumbles through debate. It seems as though we have a real issue here if there is so much up for debate when we are presented with the same thing. Can you help diagnose this problem and maybe give us a solution? What is going on?
Listen, I think you just described the problem. And it has to do with the fact that the media is now splintered into 1,000 pieces. When I was very young, you had 3 TV stations, 3 broadcast networks. And you had maybe a handful of papers that were national. And all of the journalists kind of followed the same playbook and reported on the same thing in the same way. And so whether you were conservative, liberal, black, white, you basically got the same information. And then you'd have arguments, but you were kind of occupying the same headspace. And what has happened now, you've got not just 1,000 channels on your cable or DirecTV. Not only do you have all kinds of different news outlets, but the internet and social media. So what happens then is people start choosing what information they want that reinforces their biases, that tells them what they want to hear, not necessarily what they need to hear. And that has gotten worse over time. Now, obviously I'm a Democrat and I'm a progressive, so I think that generally speaking, if you look at mainstream news outlets or outlets on the left, they fact check and stick to journalistic standards more than a lot of these right-wing news sites do. And you witness right now with the election over, and all objective folks, even Republicans who aren't in elected office, acknowledge Joe Biden won. And yet, if you were watching some of those conservative stations, they're acting like there's all kinds of fraud and illegality going on, when in fact there's no evidence of that. So at the end of the day, facts do matter. There is a pandemic going on right now. You can dismiss it and say it's not serious, and that you're not going to wear a mask, and that you're going to go ahead and go to a bar and party. Somebody will get sick. Reality will bite if you're not paying attention to it. And so we're going to have to find ways in which, particularly social media outlets now, are more careful about distributing misinformation. And that's a hard thing to do without engaging in the kind of censorship that is not part of our tradition.
Sure, you say we're going to have to find ways, but what are some of those ways? I mean, you've got people who are literally denying the fact that we are in a pandemic that has killed 250,000 people. You've got people that are believing in QAnon stuff and just being reinforced by the people eat what they're fed, and so they're being reinforced. How do we even level with people?
Well, let's take a simple example. It used to be that the broadcast networks had to provide equal time to two sides of a debate. It used to be that there were rules governing what could or could not appear on the air based on public interest. It used to be that journalists had standards of fact-checking before they report on something. Social media, it is possible, because they're private organizations, to be held accountable if they're disseminating what is patently false. So there are ways of doing this. What combination of new standards and government regulation creates at least some constraints on crazy stuff that is appearing and inflammatory stuff?
How have you learned how to work with the media? We had a conversation on the phone last week, pleasant conversation, enjoyed speaking with you then. Let's take it back to the beginning of John Branca. your career. Did you always know you wanted to be an entertainment lawyer, John? And when did that revelation come to you?
No, I didn't actually. I thought I was going to be a rock star, either that or a center fielder for the New York Yankees. Neither one of them panned out. But my two passions were always music and sports. So in retrospect, when I think back on it, it only made sense that I would end up in the music business. But that wasn't so obvious to me as I went through the stages of life. To be frank, I was a high school dropout. I signed a record deal when I was 16, and at that point, I really didn't care about school anymore, much to my parents' dismay. And without a high school degree, by the time I decided to go to college, I had to start at a junior college after getting a high school equivalent diploma. LA City College, Occidental, and then UCLA. And what happened is, after a year of practicing estate planning, of all things, at a downtown corporate firm, one day I read an article about Elton John in Time magazine, and his lawyer was quoted, Barry Tireman. I said to myself, I could do that. I could represent my idols. And the light went on, the music started playing. Filled out my resume. At the time, entertainment law was dominated by big firms, Mitchell, Silberberg, and Knupp, Loeb and Loeb. That's changed now. It's dominated by boutique firms. But I was fortunate to get a job at a firm where David Braun was the senior partner. He was one of the two or three big guys in the music business, and he represented Neil Diamond and Bob Dylan and George Harrison. So I came in working on those clients. So that's sort of how I got it started.
Mm-hmm. So can you just walk in off the street and wind up at a firm representing those folks? What kind of prep went into being able to land that job?
Well, for me, I started buying records literally when I was 6 years old. So I had this history of an incredible passionate about music and then self-taught musician. So I walked in with a certain knowledge outside of the law in terms of the music business. And, there's that old saying, if you do something you love, you'll never work a day in your life. And I definitely subscribe to that notion, because if you could have told me as a kid that I would represent Mick Jagger or Brian Wilson or Michael Jackson, I would have said, how much do I have to pay to do that? I mean, that wouldn't have been a job for me. So, I would encourage people to go into that which they love. And, I was looking, I don't know if you've seen the latest rankings of law schools that turn out the top entertainment lawyers, but the top three are USC, Harvard, and UCLA. So, of course, you already knew you were in the right place being at Harvard, but Harvard was just behind UCLA, my alma mater, in terms of the number of top entertainment lawyers.
Awesome. Well, thanks for that plug.
Yeah.
So when you first began your career at the firm, working with these sorts of clients, was your work then different than it is now? And how was it in the beginning for you?
Well, as a junior lawyer working under a couple layers of senior lawyers, you were basically given the grunt work, if you will, which is really the best way to learn, is to start at the bottom on the basics. I would say this, though, the music business is a young place. Most of the artists are young, at least the ones that are getting listened to and streamed today. So there's always opportunities for young people coming out of law school to make a mark quickly. I mean, there are some legal practices where you have to pay your dues and you have to sort of work your way up in the music industry. Like, I started representing the Beach Boys when I was 27, and I started representing Michael Jackson when I was 29. And I would say today, if you had an older artist like the Rolling Stones, they're not likely to hire somebody right out of law school. But Kendrick Lamar or Drake or the other artists, they probably don't want to hire me. They want to hire somebody young who is in their peer group. So it is an industry where you can advance fairly quickly at a young age.
Those are some pretty famous names. So what was it about John Branca that at the age of 27, the age of 29, became able to represent those individuals? Tell us about yourself and what were the key ingredients for you, John?
When I worked for David Braun, he was an older New Yorker who just moved to California. And the Beach Boys came in. Quite frankly, he didn't know who they were. And looked at Brian Wilson, who I don't know how much you know about the music business. Brian was eccentric, had a couple of nervous breakdowns, and he wanted nothing to do with it. It was like, I don't know who these people are, they're not Bob Dylan. So he turned it over to me. And for me, growing up in California listening to the Beach Boys, I was like, no, this is too good to be true. So I started working on the Beach Boys, did my homework. A couple nights I had to stay up all night long preparing because, like most rock groups, they were crazy. They were completely out of control. You find when groups start out, it's all nice and everybody loves each other. And by the time they've gotten success for a few years, they don't want to talk to each other. So walking into a band meeting is walking into a military zone. I don't get back to Boston that much anymore, but when I represented Aerosmith, I used to come back here for Aerosmith board of director meetings, if you can imagine that. Bulletproof vest and headgear required. And that's what it's like with groups. It's very different than what you might imagine.
So besides being a good lawyer, what other sorts of skills or traits does a person need to work with that level of celebrity?
Well, it's interesting because entertainment law is not like other areas of law in one respect. I would say, I assume people in this room are interested in the entertainment business, and that's why you'd be here. Being a lawyer to rock stars, I would say maybe 10% of what you do is law, maybe 20% at times, but you're a business advisor, an investment banker, an accountant to a degree, a therapist, and a rabbi or a priest. I mean, most of what you do has nothing to do with the law. So it's a little different, I would say, than what you might expect. So law school prepares you in the respect that it teaches you how to think. It teaches you how to analyze issues. But then when it comes time to actually deal with an artist, it's a little different. There's different parts of the music business, though. I have friends that do nothing but represent tech companies who want to get licenses from music companies to stream music, whether it's Spotify or the latest startup. I wouldn't have a clue how to do that, because it's a different area of expertise. You have company lawyers that work at the record companies or the touring companies. Pretty much their job is to say no most of the time. Not a job I want. I don't want to go around telling people they can't have what they want. And then representing artists, you're more like a coach, a cheerleader, the quarterback. You're out there to fight the good fight for the artist. And I think it's important to match what your skill set is with that which you're going to do as a lawyer.
Mm-hmm. And so, as a lawyer on an artist team, there are other members of the team. How do you coordinate with the other members of the team? And they, you have publicists, you have managers. Where do you fit in, and what's that activity like?
It varies from situation to situation. Some artists have big-time managers that have lots of clients and are very, very, very bright. So you tend to be more of a traditional lawyer in those settings. And we have other clients where the manager may only have one client. They may be like a partner or very artistic, and you have a much bigger role there in terms of making business recommendations and business decisions for the client.
And have you gotten really close to any of your clients over the years?
Well, yeah, my first wedding, Michael Jackson was the best man, one of the best men. And he came with his chimpanzee Bubbles, and Bubbles came with a tuxedo, a very nice pocket square. It was have some nice photos. I became close with Brian Wilson. Was the trustee of Brian's trust. We at one point had to hire a 24-hour therapist to make sure Brian, kind of took care of himself. And Mick Jagger at one point,
Does that happen naturally, or is there sort of a competition for which of the artist team members is going to be the most influential with a particular artist?
Well, when there's a lot of money and a lot of power, there's always competition. There's always jockeying for position. I had a philosophy. I never really was trying to be friends with my clients. I was there to take care of business. So I really didn't socialize that much. Michael was the exception. First of all, I don't think I'm that good socially. I try to play to my strength, which was business advice. So there are lawyers that are buddies with their artists that hang out, and that's one style. That was not my style. My style was to take care of business. It's funny, when I was a young lawyer, we had a lawyer in our firm named Mike Rosenfeld, like a very gruff guy, very bright, but very gruff, and walked around with his shirt out. And one day he was doing a negotiation for the Eagles, and I heard him in his office screaming and yelling at the record company. So I went into him, I was like 26, 27, I said, wow, I wanted to learn something. I said, Mike, so what are you doing? He said, I'm just terminating their contract with the record company. And the Eagles were huge. I said, really? I said, what's the legal theory? He said, oh, the old good guy versus bad guy theory. We're the good guys, we're terminating the contract. And that did capture some of the feel of the music business at the time because, artists were crazy, or viewed to be crazy. Record company. Selling a client out. I mean, I was.
Thanks. Because this session's about publicity and public opinion, could you talk a little bit about your discipline with the press? So many times you could have jumped in front of the microphone or taken an interview on 60 Minutes, and you chose not to. And I think it's an important discipline that you had that you should share with aspiring lawyers.
The fundamental rule I grew up with is the client is the star. We always work behind the scenes, except in building a brand within the business community. And pretty much I followed that. I never did an interview unless for example, for Michael or Mick Jagger or anybody else unless they authorized it first. That's changed after Michael passed away. I did do 60 Minutes and I did do Pierce Morgan, but I did it to promote the two Cirque shows. There was always a reason. So generally speaking, I've never spoke. I think things have changed though now. I mean, everybody's allowed to speak their mind, but when I came up, you always had the client was the star.
All right. Well, John, thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Alan. Thanks.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon and welcome. My name's Susan Hackley. I'm the Managing Director of the Program on Negotiation here at Harvard Law School. And this event is in co-sponsorship with the Committee on Sports and Entertainment Law and the Recording Artists Project, a student practice organization, all at Harvard Law School. I want to say thank you today to Johnny Lockwood for all the work he did organizing this from the California side, and here at Harvard Law School, Dallin Earl, Laura Yankwich, and Diane Long. We're filming this, so if you have friends who couldn't get here today, it'll be on the PON website in a couple of weeks. And please, no recording. Some students may need to leave at 1 o'clock for class. We understand that. Brian Price, clinical professor and director of transactional law clinics here at the law school, will be in conversation today with our guests, whom it is now my pleasure to introduce. And I want to say, I first invited John Branca on behalf of the Program on Negotiation to give a talk at Harvard Law School in 2011. He's a busy man, and we're very happy to have him here today. Feel a great sense of accomplishment. John Branca is a legal legend, entertainment lawyer extraordinaire. He's a partner and head of the music department at the prominent entertainment law firm Ziffer & Brittingham. In his youth, he was a musician and songwriter, and his group once opened for The Doors. He's a graduate of Occidental College and UCLA Law School. He has a dazzling client list, including more than 30 Rock and Roll Hall of Fame musicians, with all their business deals and personal dramas. We'll hear about some of those today. The Rolling Stones, Bob Dylan, Carlos Santana, Aerosmith, Elton John, and of course, Michael Jackson, the king of pop, one of the most famous people in the world, a philanthropist, and a highly controversial, now deceased celebrity. John Branca is negotiating big deals all day long, and that's what we're here to hear about. Please join me in welcoming John Branca.
Thank you.
John, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Professor.
Welcome to Harvard Law School. This is our first time seeing each other face to face. We had a conversation on the phone last week, pleasant conversation, enjoyed speaking with you then. Let's take it back to the beginning of John Branca, your career. Did you always know you wanted to be an entertainment lawyer, John? And when did that revelation come to you?
No, I didn't actually. I thought I was going to be a rock star, either that or a center fielder for the New York Yankees. Neither one of them panned out. But my two passions were always music and sports. So in retrospect, when I think back on it, it only made sense that I would end up in the music business. But that wasn't so obvious to me as I went through the stages of life. To be frank, I was a high school dropout. I signed a record deal when I was 16, and at that point, I really didn't care about school anymore, much to my parents' dismay. Without a high school degree, by the time I decided to go to college, I had to start at a junior college after getting a high school equivalent diploma, LA City College, Occidental, and then UCLA. And what happened is, after a year of practicing estate planning, of all things, at a downtown corporate firm, one day I read an article about Elton John in Time magazine, and his lawyer was quoted, Barry Tireman. I said to myself, I could do that. I could represent my idols. And the light went on, the music started playing. I filled out my resume. At the time, entertainment law was dominated by big firms, Mitchell, Silberberg, and Nupp, Loeb and Loeb. That's changed now. It's dominated by boutique firms. But I was fortunate to get a job at a firm where David Braun was the senior partner. He was one of the two or three big guys in the music business, and he represented Neil Diamond and Bob Dylan and George Harrison. So I came in working on those clients. So that's sort of how I got it started.
Mm-hmm. So can you just walk in off the street and wind up at a firm representing those folks? What kind of prep went into being able to land that job?
Well, for me, I started buying records literally when I was 6 years old. So I had this history of an incredible passionate about music and then self-taught musician. So I walked in with a certain knowledge outside of the law in terms of, the music business. And, there's that old saying, if you do something you love, you'll never work a day in your life. And I definitely subscribe to that notion, because if you could have told me as a kid that I would represent Mick Jagger or Brian Wilson or Michael Jackson, I would have said, how much do I have to pay to do that? I mean, that wouldn't have been a job for me. So, I would encourage people to go into that which they love. And, I was looking, I don't know if you've seen the latest rankings of law schools that turn out the top entertainment lawyers, but the top three are USC, Harvard, and UCLA. So, of course, you already knew you were in the right place being at Harvard, but Harvard was just behind UCLA, my alma mater, in terms of the number of top entertainment lawyers.
Awesome. Well, thanks for that plug.
Yeah.
So when you first began your career at the firm, working with these sorts of clients, was your work then different than it is now? And how was it in the beginning for you?
Well, as a junior lawyer working under a couple layers of senior lawyers, you were basically given the grunt work, if you will, which is really the best way to learn, is to start at the bottom on the basics. I would say this, though, the music business is a young place. Most of the artists are young, at least the ones that are getting listened to and streamed today. So there's always opportunities for young people coming out of law school to make a mark quickly. I mean, there are some legal practices where you have to pay your dues and you have to sort of work your way up in the music industry. Like, I started representing the Beach Boys when I was 27, and I started representing Michael Jackson when I was 29. And I would say today, if you had an older artist like the Rolling Stones, they're not likely to hire somebody right out of law school. But Kendrick Lamar or Drake or the other artists, they probably don't want to hire me. They want to hire somebody young who is in their peer group. So it is an industry where you can advance fairly quickly at a young age.
Those are some pretty famous names. So what was it about John Branca that at the age of 27, the age of 29, became able to represent those individuals? Tell us about yourself and what were the key ingredients for you, John?
When I worked for David Braun, he was an older New Yorker who had just moved to California. And the Beach Boys came in. Quite frankly, he didn't know who they were. And looked at Brian Wilson, who I don't know how much you know about the music business. Brian was eccentric, had a couple of nervous breakdowns. And he wanted nothing to do with it. It was like, I don't know who these people are. You know, they're not Bob Dylan. So he turned it over to me. And for me, growing up in California, listening to the Beach Boys, I was like, no, this is too good to be true. So I started working on the Beach Boys, did my homework. A couple nights I had to stay up all night long preparing because, like most rock groups, they were crazy. They were completely out of control. You find when groups start out, it's all nice and everybody loves each other. And by the time they've gotten success for a few years, they don't want to talk to each other. So walking into a band meeting is walking into a military zone. I don't get back to Boston that much anymore, but when I represented Aerosmith, I used to come back here for Aerosmith board of director meetings, if you can imagine that. Bulletproof vest and headgear required. And that's what it's like with groups. It's very different than what you might imagine.
So besides being a good lawyer, what other sorts of skills or traits does a person need to work with that level of celebrity?
Well, it's interesting because entertainment law is not like other areas of law in one respect. I would say, I assume people in this room are interested in the entertainment business, and that's why you'd be here. Being a lawyer to rock stars, I would say maybe 10% of what you do is law, maybe 20% at times, but you're a business advisor, an investment banker, an accountant to a degree, a therapist, and a rabbi or a priest. I mean, most of what you do has nothing to do with the law. So it's a little different, I would say, than what you might expect. So law school prepares you in the respect that it teaches you how to think. It teaches you how to analyze issues. But then when it comes time to actually deal with an artist, it's a little different. There's different parts of the music business, though. I have friends that do nothing but represent tech companies who want to get licenses from music companies to stream music, whether it's Spotify or the latest startup. I wouldn't have a clue how to do that, because it's a different area of expertise. You have company lawyers that work at the record companies or the touring companies. Pretty much their job is to say no most of the time. Not a job I want. I don't want to go around telling people they can't have what they want. And then representing artists, you're more like a coach, a cheerleader, the quarterback. You're out there to fight the good fight for the artist. And I think it's important to match what your skill set is with that which you're going to do as a lawyer.
Mm-hmm. And so, as a lawyer on an artist team, there are other members of the team. How do you coordinate with the other members of the team? And they, you have publicists, you have managers. Where do you fit in, and what's that activity like?
It varies from situation to situation. Some artists have big-time managers that have lots of clients and are very, very, very bright. So you tend to be more of a traditional lawyer in those settings. And we have other clients where the manager may only have one client. They may be like a partner or very artistic, and you have a much bigger role there in terms of making business recommendations and business decisions for the client.
And have you gotten really close to any of your clients over the years?
Well, yeah, my first wedding, Michael Jackson was the best man, one of the best men. And he came with his chimpanzee Bubbles, and Bubbles came with a tuxedo, a very nice pocket square. It was, have some nice photos. I became close with Brian Wilson was the trustee of Brian's trust. We at one point had to hire a 24-hour therapist to make sure Brian, kind of took care of himself. And Mick Jagger at one point,
Does that happen naturally, or is there sort of a competition for which of the artist team members is going to be the most influential with a particular artist?
Well, when there's a lot of money and a lot of power, there's always competition. There's always jockeying for position. I had a philosophy. I never really was trying to be friends with my clients. I was there to take care of business. So I really didn't socialize that much. Michael was the exception. First of all, I don't think I'm that good socially. I try to play to my strength, which was business advice. So there are lawyers that are buddies with their artists that hang out, and that's one style. That was not my style. My style was to take care of business. It's funny, when I was a young lawyer, we had a lawyer in our firm named Mike Rosenfeld, like a very gruff guy, very bright, but very gruff, and walked around with his shirt out. And one day he was doing a negotiation for the Eagles, and I heard him in his office screaming and yelling at the record company. So I went into him. I was like 26, 27. I said, wow, I wanted to learn something. I said, Mike, so what are you doing? He said, I'm just terminating their contract with the record company. And the Eagles were huge. I said, really? I said, what's the legal theory? He said, the old good guy versus bad guy theory. We're the good guys. We're terminating the contract. And that did capture some of the feel of the music business at the time, because, artists were crazy, or viewed to be crazy. Record companies would sign them up to long-term contracts. Those contracts in those days could go for 10 albums at the option of the record company. So if an artist delivered an album every 3 years, that's a 30-year contract. So you had to have some moves as a lawyer to navigate around, the big bad record company. Things have changed now. The artists have much more power. Just the same is true in sports. And the contracts are shorter. Back then, an artist couldn't do a duet with another artist without the permission in writing from the record company. It was kind of like going to the principal. Can I please do a duet? Now, it's commonplace. So a lot of things have changed. But back then, that's what it was like.
What would you say your particular negotiation style is? Are you a yeller and a screamer, or are you a different sort of negotiator? And why does your selection of choice work for you?
I'm not a yeller or a screamer. I was talking to Professor Sabinius over at the business school, and we're doing a session on Tuesday night. A lot of what happens in negotiation takes place away from the negotiating table. Professor Sabinius calls it 3D negotiation. It's really in the setup. And so yelling and screaming at the table can only be one tactic that you might use, and you might choose to use it only on an occasion. But generally speaking, the negotiations, 51% of it's probably set before you ever walk into the negotiating room, based on who the artist is, or who the parties are, what the leverage is, what you're looking for, what's important to the other side. It's not about, I remember I had a band called Poison back in the 80s, so kind of one of those hair metal bands. And they were signed to this onerous contract with a UK company, and they were a little intimidating. You never know when these guys were going to get in a fist fight, or whether at the club or in a... So I remember the bass player, Bobby Dahl, said to me, okay, John, I'm going to walk in this room, and in about 15 minutes, I'm going to go crazy. I'm going to threaten to punch out the CEO of that company, and then you just take it from there.
Did it work?
It worked. But by the time he got done screaming and we had to hold him back from attacking the CEO, that company didn't want anything to do with Poison anymore. We got him out of the contract. But it was a tactic.
So you've worked with some pretty famous people. Susan mentioned a few of the names: Beach Boys, Bob Dylan, Michael Jackson, Dr. Dre, Fleetwood Mac, Richard Pryor, Earth, Wind & Fire, and so on, Elton John. Is there any difference between working with a super celebrity and a standard artist just coming up?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Tell us about the differences.
Well, when an artist is just getting started, they need all the help they can get, all the breaks. And so, the business people can loom large in their life to try to equalize the lack of bargaining position between the artist and the company. When an artist is a superstar, they're used to getting their way. Everybody's catering to them. And so then the difficult part is trying to help the artist stay on track in terms of what they're trying to do, Michael's in particular. But there could be a big difference. Every once in a while, you see a new artist. There was an artist named Terence Trent D'Arby. I'm sure I'm mentioning names that people don't know. But Terence was arrogant and confident from day one. So I'll never forget came through customs in England, and there was that thing on the customs form that says, "Do you have anything to declare?" And he put, "I am a genius." Now, there's a guy that was confident.
So we talked a little bit about negotiating with an opposing party. How do you negotiate with your artist when the artist is a super celebrity? And tell us something about those sorts of interactions. You mentioned keeping an artist on track.
Well, I think there's two things that go into it. I'm a big believer in branding, no matter what you do, as an attorney or otherwise. So over the years, I tried to cultivate a certain brand or image so that before an artist might come in the room to interview me, they already thought they knew what I was about, or certainly what I stood for. And part of my brand, I have sort of two main competitors, one in Atlanta and one in New York, who, my friend in New York always felt, if I represent the record company, I'm gonna get the artist. I was the opposite. Like growing up in the 60s, getting kicked out of school, I always had a chip on my shoulder when it came to big organizations and the government. And I view the record company in that light. So my whole thing is I'm gonna represent the artist, never gonna represent the record company, never gonna have to wake up in the morning and decide whose side am I on today. I got one side, I'm here to take care of the artist. And so over the years, we did some things that other people might not have done. Toni Braxton, we're trying to renegotiate her contract. We put her in bankruptcy, terminated her contract. Carlos Santana, after the Supernatural album, sold 25 million albums. And they sold a company, Clive Davis left, a new guy comes in. We took the legal position that was documented by a real lawyer, who I want to introduce soon, that there was an implied, in fact, key man clause that without Clive Davis at the company, the contract was no longer enforceable. Now, if you tried to make that argument in a corporate setting, when you're dealing with a mega company, they would laugh you out of the place. They would put one of their Wall Street firms on to crush you. But that kind of thing actually works in the music business because they know the artists, if they don't make a record, the company doesn't make any money. So we use that basis to renegotiate Carlos's contract. So I tried to cultivate an image that I was an artist attorney, I could never be controlled, I was always going to try to do the right thing for the artist, and that having built up a large practice of superstars, people felt I always knew what the best deals were, so nobody could fool me in that. So that was part one, was branding. So if an artist came in to see me, and my friend Mike Rosenfeld, who I mentioned, there was always this feeling that you had to create this aura, that you had some magical power, that you could do something that nobody else could do, so the artist would believe in you. So you would go into a negotiation and they would think, he's going to get me everything he can. So that was part of the brand. But then part two is sometimes you get an artist that gets so big and so internationally known that they don't really like to hear the word no. In fact, some people get fired for saying the word no. And, as I sort of started with Michael Jackson when I was 29 and he was 21, and the Thriller came out, sold 100 million albums, and we bought the Beatles catalog and did the Bad Tour, the biggest tour in the world at that time. And kings and queens wanted to know Michael, and Marlon Brando. I mean, everybody wanted to get to Michael. With Michael, it was tricky. I love Michael. He was like a brother to me. But sometimes you had to figure out ways, to present something to him that he didn't want to hear. So one of the things I would use would be the third party. Like, okay, Mike, some people are saying that, this or that or the other. No, I don't believe it necessarily, but some people say that. And it was a way to introduce a concept that you didn't have to take ownership of and get fired with over. So, there's different techniques. It's probably not unlike dealing with a parent or a girlfriend or a boyfriend or a spouse. Sometimes you just have to come up with a couple of moves to get what you want.
So having clients who are in the public eye all the time, high-level celebrities, were you ever thinking about the media and the publicity effect of any deals you were negotiating and how those might be perceived out there in the media world?
Yeah, always had to give effect. I mean, after all, when you're dealing with an artist or an actor or a celebrity, there's always going to be the media is very important in how somebody's perceived. They cared about it, you had to care about it, and you had to be smart about it. And different artists care about different things. I mean, there's some artists that if you did a big deal for them, they didn't want anybody to know. So there'd be no media which signed the deal. And there are other artists that felt like they were in competition So I remember when I did the first so-called mega deal for Aerosmith, when we got them off of Geffen Records and brought them to Sony. It was very important to Stephen that this deal be trumpeted, as bigger than the Rolling Stone or whatever the thing was at the time. So big announcement, mega deal, biggest deal for a rock band ever. And, that was kind of part of what one would do for Aerosmith. Of course, then I did a deal for the Rolling Stones a year later, and that would, so every artist is different. Now, in the age of social media now, where there are almost no secrets, it becomes even trickier. I mean, there's always going to be somebody that disagrees with what you do or has an opinion about what you do, and you can't always control that. But thinking about the media is very important for a celebrity.
So you had mentioned being a business advisor for clients too. So the effect of media today with social media, how different is it than earlier in your career? And how have you learned how to work with the media, utilize the media for whatever your aims might be?
Well, I'm older, and I would venture to say that virtually everybody in this room is probably going to be more adept at dealing with social media than I am. I'm smart enough to hire people who know what they're doing, and it's important. It's especially important, where the artist is not here to speak for themselves.
So speaking about publicity, there's positive publicity and there's also negative publicity. So when an artist faces negative publicity, what's your role in working with the artist, counseling the artist? And if you could talk a little bit about that.
We are experts. Jim Bates is here from the Citric firm, one of the very top PR firms in the world, really. So very important to get skilled people involved who can help shape public opinion. And to some degree, what you're trying to do is portray and convey who the artist really is, as opposed to who the press or the media think they are. What makes it even more challenging is, my sense is it used to be First Amendment. The media was there to try to get the facts. You try to get both sides. You could read the New York Times or Wall Street, and you'd think you were getting some effort at the truth. It's kind of changed. I think there's a rush for legacy media to get readership, to get eyeballs. They're competing with blogs. They're competing, and their ability to research, investigate, and vet stories, either because of laziness, lack of resources, or the rush to compete with blogs has diminished. So what you read now in the papers can't necessarily take it at face value anymore.
Without mentioning names necessarily, how do you feel with a client that you think has earned their negative publicity?
Say that again?
If you're working with a client and you perceive that they've actually earned the negative publicity that they're receiving, without mentioning names unless you want to, how do you feel about working with a client like that? And how do you as a lawyer and a counselor navigate those kind of scenarios?
Well, you have to separate the art from the artist. And it's certainly possible to represent a great, great artist who maybe is not getting the kind of publicity they might want, either deservedly or not deservedly. But if you believe in the artist, you still want to help them. You still want to sort of help them, you know.
These are great. Don't get anywhere. In
No,
this
that's
business.
absolutely true. And ironically, on the Berry Gordy clause, there was bifurcated whether he was a substantial character or an incidental character, and which lane you went down was what the restrictions were. So as we were creating a Michael Jackson Broadway play or a Michael Jackson biopic, we needed to go back and read that language.
Welcome.
These are great stories, and I'm sure people have a lot of questions. And just before we go to student questions, you have a number of associates here. And I just fourth audience at Harvard, and you're still going strong. I mean, going from your initial, how did I get hired by Michael? How did I prove myself by getting much more than he was aspiring to? How did we get the masters when that was an audacious request? And then, the Thriller situation and on to the ATV case, which then led to the Sony partnership and on to EMI and later. There are a lot of these things and very interesting principles and observations that we could make in each of them. You've given us a lot to think about. We're going to want to digest this, but for all of us, I really want to offer deep thanks.
Thank you. This was the best one yet. Thank you.
All right, why don't we get started? And we're going to have other people wander in. A number of people had events that ended at 6 or 6:15 or otherwise, and that's just fine. But the opportunity to spend some time together and talk about some really remarkable negotiations is a special one. And in a moment, I will introduce our guest. John Branca has been kind enough to come here. And many of you will know a little bit about his background from the information that was sent out. He's partner and head of the music department at Zephyrin Bredeman. And he comes from a family of sort of distinguished public figures. Your mom, I guess, was a dancer on the Ed Sullivan Show?
Correct. Yep.
Your great uncle was Ralph Branca, and for those of you who were baseball historian fans, 3-time All-Star, who pitched in the 1951 National League Series and pitched a fastball that was hit out of the park and handed the series to the Giants rather than the Brooklyn Dodgers at the time.
It was actually my uncle.
Your uncle?
Yes.
And the shot heard round the world for those of you who were do that. John, before he grew up and became a lawyer, started his own band. It was good enough to open for the Doors, who later became his client. But so he kind of comes to this field out of a love of music, and as I've learned, out of a love of deal making. His clients are legion, more than 30 in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and that includes people from Aerosmith and the Beach Boys and Bob Dylan and the Doors, on through to any number of Elton John, and then the Rolling Stones, Elvis Presley's, and and then some other clients such as Mike Tyson and Richard Pryor. So this is somebody who's been in the middle of deals involving all sorts of interesting people. His best known client, of course, is Michael Jackson. And we're going to spend time in the first part of our a block of time together talking about some of the deals in which he was involved on behalf initially of Michael Jackson, and later, after Michael Jackson's untimely death in 2009, some of the deals involving his estate, which are pretty interesting in and of themselves. But we, and here I'm thinking of a Harvard we, have worked John hard since he's been here. So at a Harvard Law School lunch yesterday, he talked about celebrities, attorneys, and deals. At the law school dinner, issues in entertainment law. At lunch, moderated by Srini Pillai, who's a professor at the medical school and joining us here, talking about social media and trial by social media. And you're still standing, and so now we can talk about what's most important to us, which is deals. So the format of this, I'm going to spend some time, probably 45 minutes or thereabouts, talking through some negotiations with John that I think you'll find interesting. Then we'll open it up to conversation. My strong preference would be to focus on the negotiation and deal-making side, but the topics are wide open, so if people want to talk about the recent HBO documentary, if they want to talk about other things, that's perfectly in bounds. But our comparative advantage, I think, here is negotiation and deal-making. So those questions would be especially welcome. So, John, when he was a 29-year-old attorney out of UCLA, working in a prominent firm, but in a very junior capacity, was introduced to Michael Jackson, who was at that time 21. And one of his early deals, which is interesting, Michael Jackson wanted from BMI, if he could possibly get $200,000 for songwriting. He wanted it. John came back with $600,000. And so that was a big plus. Well, Michael kept asking for things that were a stretch. And one thing that was a stretch was at one point he asked you to get control of his masters, the master recordings. And I wonder, John, if I could, in a moment, ask you about that deal. Before you do, though, I do want to recognize a couple of your colleagues who are here, because while you might be the principal soloist, you've got a very skilled ensemble.
Absolutely.
And so Howard Weitzman, litigator. We have Brian Friedman. And Jenna Hurt, his wife and an actress in her own regard. Now Jenna Branca, and Buck Lockwood, who is there. I did mention Dr. Pillai, and Jared, who's going to be coming around, a USC student who will be coming around. And while there's excellent filmmaking happening in the back, you'll fix that, right? So that's the group.
Karen Langford.
And Karen Langford, who is, I had the pleasure of negotiating the video release with. And she's skilled, She has a remarkably fine scalpel. You don't even know you're being sliced. And in any case, we
I'll
so
also mention Michael Caine and Jim Bates, part of our
indeed,
team.
indeed. So we're it's a pleasure to have you here at the business school, and we can launch into it. So I wonder, John, could you give us just a quick sense for those who don't know the music publishing industry, a little bit of a sense of master recordings versus the copyright ownership on songs and the publishing side of things, just a quick sense of what that means. And then when an artist asks you for the masters, that virtually never happens. And Michael asked you for those. Correct. And so if you could take it from here.
Sure. Well, there are different IP rights. There's the ownership of the song, and a song can be sung by anybody, and the songwriter, the owner of the song, profits no matter who sings the song. And then there's the recording of the song. And the ownership of the recording generates generally more income than the song. And when we're looking back historically, very few artists own their own master recordings. Certainly at the time that we went after and tried to obtain that right from Michael. Generally speaking, because the record companies finance the production, marketing, and release of the recordings, they don't like to give up ownership. That's part of the core business that they own.
And so Michael said, I want those masters. And I think your view was, okay, taken under advisement, but that might not be the time to press.
Right. I mean, I started representing Michael just after Off the Wall was released, and it was an important album. It was a big album, but it was before Thriller. And in 1982, in December, he released the Thriller album, which went on to become the biggest selling album in the history of the music business, 100 million copies sold worldwide. And that sort of changed everything for Michael and also for me, quite frankly. But Michael talked about owning the master recording soon after Thriller came out, and at that moment in time, it might not have been feasible. We had to wait until the opportunity arose.
So perhaps a phone call would not have been expected, where you get a call from Walter Yetnikoff, a kind of storied figure in the music industry, saying, I'm not going to let Michael kiss the monster. What was that about, and how did that relate to the first piece?
Well, Michael was late in delivering the Thriller album, and during that interim period, he sat down with Steven Spielberg, who had just put out the movie E.T., which was this huge phenomenon. And Steven asked Michael to narrate a storybook album, the story of E.T., and Michael wrote a song and sang it, and it was a very deluxe, elaborate box set back when people actually bought records. Maybe before your time, but it was a very nice box set with pictures and color photographs and whatnot. And the only problem was Michael recorded this for Universal Music, a competitor to Michael's own label. And Michael was an exclusive recording artist for Epic Records, which later became Sony. And nobody bothered to get permission to allow Michael to do that. So Universal released this box set. It was a very expensive, elaborate affair. E.T. was a huge, huge, huge film. And Walter, who ran the label, was not happy. And he sued and got an injunction against MCA Universal, which was run by a mythical figure, Lou Wasserman. And they were required to pull all of those albums out of the stores throughout the country. There were thousands of stores, and they had to remove them from the stores.
And the cover of that, I understand, was Michael Jackson kissing E.T.
Well, he wasn't kissing him, but you had a picture of Michael with his arm around E.T. the extraterrestrial. I don't know if you've seen the movie, but E.T. is this cute little extraterrestrial figure, and Michael's sitting there in a sweater with his arm around E.T. like it was his best buddy. Wasn't actually kissing him, but I got a call one day from Walter Yetnikoff. I was in the middle of a meeting with the Beach Boys and Jerry Weintraub, another mythical figure in the business, and I had to leave the meeting, and the only thing he said to me is, tell Michael to stop kissing the monster. I'm, maybe 31 at the time, it was before Thriller came out, and I said, Walter, what are you talking about? He said, tell Michael to stop kissing the monster. I will not have Michael Jackson kiss the monster. This is all he said over and over. Now, this man is the chairman of a very important record company. I don't know that he went to Harvard. He might have. Or it was either Columbia or Harvard. You're talking about a well-educated man, lawyer by training, and all he could say over and over is, tell Michael to stop kissing the monster. So it took me a minute to figure out, pardon the language, what the hell is he talking about? And I realized it was the E.T. album that was in stores. So we couldn't stop him. He was uncontrollable, huge ego. Felt like he'd been slighted, so he brought an injunction against Universal. They had to pull the album out of the stores, and a great consternation. Spielberg was pissed, Wasserman was pissed, Scheinberg, everybody was pissed.
And could you say a little bit more about Walter, other than whatever his educational pedigree was? I dealt with him a little bit many years ago on Wall Street, and there are a lot of deals I've forgotten about, but not that one. Could you characterize Walter Yetnikoff as somebody who's just ordered you to have your famous client stop doing something and an injunction? What's the guy like?
Walter was this big Russian bear, bigger than life, heavy drinking, liked to party, and huge ego. He was very good with artists. Bob Dylan, Neil Diamond, Barbra Streisand, they loved him. Signed the Rolling Stones later on in their career. Artists loved him, but nobody in the business. You never wanted to get Walter pissed off because he was incontrollable once he got pissed off, and screaming and yelling and somewhat vulgar. But I loved him. It was a good guy. It was a pleasure to deal with him. But he was just a big Russian bear.
So you figured out.
That's the nicest I've ever heard anybody describe Walter.
So
I was on his good side.
And by the way, I've asked, there are many people among those who we introduced as well to chime in, because they lived many